Welcome back to Proxima, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about the new GW reveals on Psychic and Morale in 10th edition, and we're going to be talking about how this will affect the Craftworld Eldar. So not so much in terms of morale, because Eldar have always had a pretty good morale and leadership value in general, but the Eldar are known for having a very powerful Psychic phase, and the changes that GW revealed about the Psychic phase and Psychic powers in general have me a little bit worried as to where Psychic powers will be for the Eldar in 10th edition. Now, we're going to go through the changes. I'm not going to spoil too much right off the bat, but I will say this. Some of the changes have me a little bit concerned about a couple of our most powerful psychers, namely Farseers. And although nothing has yet been confirmed about the Farseer, we haven't seen the datasheet or anything like that. We have seen the librarian datasheet, which I will go over. And the librarian datasheet is a very slimmed down version of what even the librarian used to get. So I can only imagine what the Eldar are going to have. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into the video. So what we're going to be talking about in this video is we're going to just go bit by bit over the reveals that GW has given us regarding Psychic powers and morale in 10th edition. And we'll be talking a little bit about how these changes will affect the Craftworld Eldar based on what we know so far. So right off the bat, they give us a picture in the GW community article of Eldar fighting Thousand Sons. So as you know, as many of you might know, Eldar and the Thousand Sons are the premier psychic factions of 40K. Now, they did this on purpose. This wasn't a coincidence. They put this image here because they knew that these changes would most likely affect the Eldar and Thousand Sons the most. So right after they say that, they actually give you an overview in the article of how the new turn will work. So basically there's just 5 phases now. Psychic and Morale are rolled into different phases. Morale is done in the command phase, and Psychic is either done in the movement or shooting phase or charge or fight phase, depending on, what the power does and what the power specifies in the datasheet. And right after they say that, they go into what the Psychic phase will now be. So it is going to be something that is rolled into other phases, but as they stated here, they basically didn't like how the Psychic phase worked because a lot of factions didn't get to participate fully in the Psychic phase. Now, I honestly don't agree with this sentiment at all, outside of some mortal wound spamming builds that basically just spammed mortals at people. And honestly, I think the problem was with mortal wounds, not with Psychic powers. So I thought the Psychic phase was a pretty balanced phase, and yeah, some armies benefited from it more than others, but those factions were balanced in a way that was, complementary to their strengths. So for example, Thousand Sons were a very Psychic-based army, but they had weaknesses. Thousand Sons were a very slow faction outside of a few abilities that allowed them to move a little bit faster or teleport into battle. So Thousand Sons really also had a limited roster. They really had to rely on things like sorcerers and things like that to give them the power they needed against certain targets. And again, Thousand Sons really didn't have a lot of heavy armor cracking ability. So they needed things like Doom Bolt and stuff like that to be able to make up for that. The Craftworld Eldar, on the other hand, used a lot of their Psychic powers to boost the synergies of their army and make them very lethal or very durable, depending on what you needed at that particular moment. So it was very much a case of 2 factions, the Thousand Sons and the Eldar, who needed Psychic powers in order to bring out the main strengths of their armies. And I really think GW really oversimplified and undervalued the importance that Psychic powers played in both of those factions' balance. So, they say here, watching your opponents make a bunch of mysterious 2d6 rolls and remove models accordingly. Again, I don't think that was the case for a lot of Psychic powers. I think a lot of Psychic powers were buffs or abilities. There weren't a lot of Psychic powers out there, aside from Thousand Sons, again, which force you to just remove a bunch of models. So honestly, that sentiment is not just their opinion, it's just factually untrue. So reading that, I was a little bit disappointed in their standpoint on Psychic powers. Now, they do go over how Witchfire powers will work. They will be done in the shooting phase now, so things like Smite, Things like Executioner will now be done in the shooting phase. And you can either manifest it as a regular power with no risk, or you can manifest it as a overcharged power, which gives it the hazardous weapon ability, which I assume if you roll a 1 on it to hit or something like that, you'll suffer a mortal wound. And as you can see, this is very much the case. The Smite on the Librarian's datasheet has a Witchfire and a Focused Witchfire. The Focused Witchfire is much stronger, has a stronger strength, has more AP, and that's about it. But it does have the hazardous weapon quality as well. Now, to be honest with you, looking at this, I have to admit, the D6 attacks is good and all. But one thing you might notice is that Smite is no longer dealing mortal wounds. It just has a fixed AP value. So Smite, in its regular form, is just going to have Strength 5, AP -1, Damage D3. That's not that good. To be honest with you, that's not that great. Smite is actually probably worse than it was before in a number of ways. And you're hitting on a 3+, so you might only hit twice with an average of a D6 roll. And those 2 attacks may wound once, and you may get 1 armor save at -1. Guys, I don't know how else to say this, but this is not a very good shooting attack. It is 24 inches, so that is improved, but you're not getting the same level of power as you were before, even with just D3 mortal wounds. So I think it's safe to say that things like Smite spam and stuff like that are out the window. I don't think you will be able to do this anymore. In fact, I would wager that basically all factions have a similar type of Smite ability. And even though some factions may have a more powerful version, it's not going to ever be as good as the psychic powers of last edition, or this current edition, 9th edition, which were doing mortal wounds. The Librarian also has 2 abilities. It has a Psychic Hood, which basically gives your unit a 4+ feel no pain against psychic attacks. So the unit gets some extra defenses against it. So this makes me also believe that psychic shooting is going to be even less effective, because basically units that also have a psyker in them might have some sort of defense against it. And lastly, the Librarian has the Veil of Time psychic buff, which is kind of what I was thinking when characters were revealed to join units again. I was thinking that Farseers and Warlocks might give passive buff to units, and I happen to be right on this one. They do. In fact, the Veil of Time is no longer a psychic power that you have to cast. It's just a passive buff that gives you a sustained 1 ability to hit. Which, to be honest with you guys, is not that great either, right? It's good to have it based on your weapons, but what's not good is paying a bunch of points for a Librarian and Terminator armor only to give your unit sustained 1 to hit on their abilities. So basically exploding 6 is the hit. Again, that's not that great, right? And because most psychic attacks in the game are going to be extremely weaker, the Psychic Hood ability is also not that great. So basically, just looking at this Librarian, guys, I'm seeing kind of a dead model as far as its rules go. Now, different Librarians, they've stated, might have different psychic powers, but already I'm looking at the Terminator Librarian, and I'm just thinking that this guy's pretty weak, and I don't know about you, but I would rather have a Primaris Lieutenant in my unit than a Librarian in Terminator armor. A, the Primaris is probably much cheaper. B, it gives the unit much better buffs, in my opinion. So we will have to wait and see on the full rules reveal. There may be some kind of combinations you can pull off with the Librarian. I don't know. I'm not a Space Marine player, nor will I ever be. I hate Space Marines, to be honest with you. I think they're a boring faction in general. But I have to be honest, the Librarian doesn't look that impressive. And if I must say so, I don't think that really bodes well for the other psychers in other armies. Now, they do talk a little bit about the Librarian. They talk about the Veil of Time being a sustained hits ability, being a passive buff. And they say each Space Marine Librarian brings their own flavor of psychic powers to the battle. The Orc Weird Boy is something they also talk about. Now, the Orc Weird Boy, on the other hand, does look a little bit interesting, but not because his warp fire powers are good, but because his ability is actually good. So this is where I can see some Librarians actually being good, is if their ability is good, and some other models in other army books being effective as well. So if we look at the Weird Boy's datasheet and we look at the jump ability, It looks absolutely insane. Basically what it is it's Skyleap in the movement phase. So you can take a unit of orcs that the Weird Boy is joined with, especially a big unit, because the Weird Boy actually gets stronger when he's with bigger units. And you can basically Skyleap to anywhere in the battlefield you want to on a 2+. If you roll a 1, you're kind of fucked, and your unit just kind of sits there and just has to, basically just be shot at or whatever. But in most of the cases, your unit of 20 boys is going to be in your opponent's face, shooting with shooter weapons, obliterating your target, and possibly even assaulting. I'm not sure if there's some sort of orc ability that allows them to assault after using some sort of ability like this. I don't know. But I'm also guessing there's nothing preventing you from being able to assault after this as well. So orcs, with their probably many to be buffs to their charge distance and rerolls to charge distance, they'll probably have something like that in the form of a wah or something. They're going to be able to really deliver a lot of boys to you, possibly turn 1 with 3 of these guys attached to 3 units. Now, yeah, 1 unit might roll a 1 and might just sit there and do nothing, but you're going to have a lot of your army getting in your face turn 1 and possibly even assaulting. So I'm not an orc player, probably never will be, to be honest. They're just not really my style, but this looks really fun for a lot of orc players out there. Taking 3 of these guys possibly and jumping, 60 boys in your opponent's face turn 1, either with shoot-a boys or burn-a boys or, you're just regular orc boys. Seems pretty powerful, especially if you can assault afterward. Now, I don't know if there's any kind of limit to basically being able to take these weird boys, other than the common rule of 3, but this looks to be pretty powerful, and this is one of those cases where I think a psyker can be useful. Now, his shooting attack, however, isn't really that great in my opinion, but, it's decent. Now, moving on to the morale phase. Morale is now done in the command phase for units that have lost more than half their models. So if the unit has not lost more than half their models, they don't have to take a test. But if they do, they have to roll 2d6 on their leadership. And you basically have to equal to or roll above your new leadership characteristic. And if you fail, the unit suffers some penalties until your next turn. So it is not a permanent loss. It's not a permanent thing. It just, until your next turn, you suffer these effects. The effects are, your objective control characteristic goes to 0, which means you can't control objectives anymore. If it falls back, you have to make a desperate escape test for every model in the unit. I'm guessing that if you do choose to fall back, it is a choice. If you fail this test, your model dies. Basically, you're run down and killed. So that can be kind of interesting. And its controlling player cannot use stratagems to affect that unit, which, to be honest with you, is pretty big. That could mean a lot of things, depending on what stratagems each faction gets. So here's the thing, though. What this doesn't do is it doesn't affect the model's ability to shoot or fight in close combat. So Battle Shock is no longer going to affect those things. So even though a unit might fail its morale, it's going to be doing the same amount of damage as before. Its damage isn't reduced, its ballistic skill or weapon skill isn't going to be reduced, so they can still fight at full potential. So even though it's going to matter big time for the objective game, it's not going to matter so much for the damage game. All right, so how are these changes going to affect the Craftworld Eldar based on what we know so far? So based on what we have seen so far, true psychic tests are going to be gone. Basically, a lot of abilities are going to either auto-pass or pass on a 2+. Basically, the days of rolling a psychic test are over. Craftworld Eldar may or may not get an extra benefit from being effective psychers. That has yet to be seen, but to be honest with you, based on what we've seen so far, my guess is that they won't. So they're just going to get some passive buffs, and that's about it. If they do have to roll something, it'll probably be on a 2+, and maybe they'll get to re-roll it. That's about it, if they do get something like that, but that's yet to be determined. Farseers and Warlocks will probably get 1 offensive power, used as a shooting attack, and 1 or 2 buffs that only affect the unit they are joined with. And this is where I think it's a real big benefit for Warlocks, because Warlocks were kind of one of those units who did that anyway. Their powers were used to debuff or buff friendly units, but the casting value on their powers was rather high at 7, so oftentimes you would fail a couple times during a game if you didn't use Strands of Fate or some other buff. So I think Warlocks getting passive bonuses and passive effects to the units they join is very good. I think that's a good change in general for Warlocks. However, for Farseers, I don't think this is good because Farseers were really one of those units that were able to buff different units in your army depending on what you needed that turn, and it looks like they're going to be losing that if they don't get anything specific in their datasheet that helps them out with it. And basically, knowing what we know now, the psychic passive buffs in general do not look that strong. Sustained 1 from the librarian looks weaker than his lieutenant counterparts buffs, and we will probably lose quite a few psychic powers. I'm guessing Guide, Fortune, and Doom will all be included somehow in Eldar. I don't know how they can't be. They were the classic psychic powers of Eldar. They've always been in here. They're probably going to still be in here, but they might be weaker. And they're most definitely going to be weaker in the case that, you can only affect your own unit that you're joined with. And like I said before, this is looking good for Warlocks and Spirit Seers that had issues casting most of the time anyway, without Strands of Fate or buffs to test, and their passive abilities are probably going to be pretty good. They're going to be wanting to be in units anyway, be in units of Wraithguard or other units to buff their combat prowess or shooting prowess, or survivability in general. However, Farseers are looking to lose the most, losing the ability to cast on different units depending on the situation that they find themselves in. When we're talking about morale doesn't seem like a bad change, honestly. And in my opinion, doesn't negatively impact the Eldar whatsoever. Units that are under half strength are probably not going to be controlling objectives anyhow. Now, I can say this for a fact, that our tough units that will be holding objectives have really high leadership values, so we'll probably not have issues with this. And I actually foresee Wraiths being quite good at this new role. Having a very high leadership value, which in this edition would basically mean a lower value, you're probably going to see a leadership value of 4+, or maybe even 3+ from Wraith units, in my opinion, means that they're not going to be failing morale checks a lot, and they're not going to be losing their objective control abilities. So I think that's going to be quite powerful, and mixing that with the fact that Warlocks and Spirit Seers are probably going to get some pretty decent passive buffs to Wraithguard and Wraith Blades, I think you're going to see Wraiths being much more successful in games. Okay, so in conclusion, just to wrap this up, it looks like Farseers might actually not be an auto-include anymore, depending on how strong their datasheet is. If their datasheet allows them to cast Guide and cast Doom and cast Fortune on different units in the Eldar army, I think they're still going to be an auto-include, for sure. If it doesn't, I think that you're going to see less people using Farseers, maybe one Farseer in a list to buff a certain unit, but that's it. And I truly think this will be a shame, because in this edition, for the first time, basically since the beginning of the game itself, Eldar Farseers will be unable to cast an ability on a unit that they are not joined with. So even back in 3rd edition, by the way, when Farseers and all characters basically had to join units to be immune to sniping effects, and basically just targeted by shooting in general, Farseers back then were still able to cast Guide and Fortune on units within 6 inches that they weren't joined with. So that gave them a little bit of flexibility, and you would often see people still including a Farseer in a list with Guide and Fortune, because that was a really powerful ability. And often back then you would see Farseers joining Seer Councils, which is another thing I might think will actually happen. So you might see the return of Seer Councils just because of the fact that if Farseers can only affect the unit they're joined with, certain powers are just not going to be that good. But if you were able to take Warlock Skyrunners in certain amounts, so probably in larger units than 3 as they stand now, you would actually be able to have a really great unit that could do a lot of damage and be very tough, right? A unit with Guide and Fortune on it could be a very difficult prospect to deal with if the Farseer can indeed be joined with Warlock Skyrunners. So that could be a really good possibility. If Warlock Skyrunners can go up to 5 models a unit, I think that would be really cool. Really expensive for those of you wanting to buy one of those units that don't already have Warlocks on bikes. But yeah, we're going to have to wait and see on that, because who knows, right? As we know it, Warlock units might be reduced. So we just have to hang tight on that and just wait a little bit longer on that one. And honestly, in general, I could see psychic powers and psychic abilities being something that feels a lot less epic, which is sad because I think Craftworld Eldar are one of the most psychic intuitive factions, and it's really fun to cast psychic abilities, I have to say. So losing that is going to feel pretty bad. And even though Guy, Doom, and Fortune are still going to be in the book somehow, they're going to feel probably a lot less powerful. And then lastly, of course, when talking about morale, I think the morale changes aren't that big of a deal. I actually think they're a very positive thing for the game in general. I really do like the changes to morale and how they have described how morale works. I think it's pretty cool. So I'm glad for that. I'm glad that our units don't basically die anymore and they don't get their damage reduced. I think that's great. I think the objective part of it is going to be tough, but on the units that are good at holding objectives, things like Wraithguard, Wraithblades, and even Guardians might get leadership buffs and might be okay with staying on objectives and basically being pretty effective at holding down objectives. So the good news is I don't think we have to worry much about that. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. I have another video coming out shortly covering the new transport rules. So GW did release transport rules earlier today. I've been a little bit behind covering this stuff, but honestly, it just seems like so much all at once with all the reveals and the other responsibilities that I have. So I will be getting those videos out shortly, but probably not immediately. I do plan to cover transports too. And guess what? Transports are looking pretty good again. I kind of was right in saying that transports are going to be strong. I was actually quite happy to see the new transport rules, and I think we can say safely now that Wave Serpents and Falcons are well and truly back, and they're looking very strong. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thank you once again to all my Patreons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. I will leave my Patreon and PayPal links in the description for those of you who do want to support the channel. Thank you so much to all of those who have. I really appreciate your support. All right, everybody, have a great one. Have some great games, and I'll see you next time. Peace out, everybody. See you later.